The Haunting Tales of Dark Shivering. Dark Shivering, the place to be on a dark, stormy night. If you enjoy the abnormal paranormal, then stay a while and see what oddities pop up. Shapeshifter. Mrs. Sallow had lived in her ancestral home her whole life. To others it was a drafty, rambling old mansion, but to her it was a comfortable home. Shivering Hall had stood in dark Shivering back when it was called Witchester. Witchester, meaning witch's holy place, had always had an air of magic surrounding it, and Shivering Hall was no different. It had been in Mrs. Sallow's family for over 8 generations, through her father's side of the family, who had connections back to Charles II. Mrs. Sallow was in her 60s, and even though she was still fit and able, she had a small staff of people come in to attend to her home and her personal care. Shivering Hall was very large, with most of the attic rooms shut off to the rest of the house. They were run down and worn out but hidden nicely behind a wooden door. She spent her days reading in the gardens, writing in her study, and directing her staff to run the house smoothly. Wood was chopped from the forest for winter. Fruit was picked in the summer for preservation, and vegetables were dug from the garden for canning. For years whilst her parents were still alive, Mrs. Sallow would spend January and February in South Africa on a family friend's plantation. But since getting older, she had become a homebody, and had no intention of flying anywhere ever again. Each season brought new colors to the house and garden, and she enjoyed all of them equally. Although Mrs. Sallow loved her home and felt at peace there, the same could not be said of her staff. The positions she had originally wanted to be filled had offered free accommodation in the mansion. And although she found people to fill the jobs, none of them would stay in the house, all preferring to live in dark Shivering Village. In 1972, Mrs. Sallow had been contacted by the British Library about her own extensive compendium of books. It housed hundreds of publications dating back to the 1600s, and many antique documents going back even further. The British Library was interested in cataloguing her collection, with the possibility of loaning anything of particular interest for the public's perusal. It was agreed that in the winter of 1972, Mr. Boggart would stay at Shivering Hall and begin the arduous task of recording the classic collection. Mr. Boggart had travelled up from London on the train in November of 1972. It was a cold, wet, miserable-looking day the whole length of his journey. He arrived in Gloucester train station and was collected promptly by Mrs. Sallow's handyman, Arthur. Arthur was a jolly man, and the two men chatted amiably on the hour or so journey. Mr. Boggart expressed his delight at staying at Shivering Hall, as he had never visited this part of the country before. To which he found Arthur's reply quite unusual. He said, "If you find you need alternative accommodation, there is the dark Shivering Inn that has rooms to let." Mr. Boggart had no intention of not staying at Shivering Hall. He had heard about its long history, and although it was logged and photographed in the Homes of Distinction publication 1954, it was a private residence and so the general public could not visit. As they arrived at Shivering Hall, even the grey skies couldn't dampen Mr. Boggart's enthusiasm for it. They hurried out of the rain with Mr. Boggart's luggage, his eyes full of delight at the imposing building. As they entered into the foyer, a large wet dog ran in behind Mr. Boggart, pushing past his leg and heading down a long passage off to the right. It obviously knew where it was heading, and Arthur said not to worry about the dog, and to just ignore him. Not something a dog lover like himself was capable of, thought Boggart to himself. Arthur took Mr. Boggart up to his room on the 2nd floor. He was the only person staying, and he was in the west wing by himself. He soaked up the atmosphere of the long, rather dark corridor as Arthur explained that Mrs. Sallow had taken to her bed with an ankle injury. She was upset at not welcoming Mr. Boggart herself, but had been advised by the doctor to keep her ankle raised and to rest. She would set herself up in the lounge in due course to accept visitors. As for now, Mr. Boggart would have to rely on the staff for any guidance, and was told to make himself at home. Mrs. Sallow was in the East Wing, and it was to be the only part of the building that was private. Once dropping his luggage upstairs, Arthur gave Boggart a quick tour of the building. He would be leaving soon as it was about to get dark. Mrs. Evans, who was the housekeeper and cook, would be on hand until 6 p.m. for any food or drink requirements, but her husband picked her up promptly, and so Boggart would be alone after this. The staff would return at 8 a.m. every morning. Mr. Boggart was surprised when he saw the library for the first time. He had imagined plush furniture and the odd shelved wall, but this library was a lot larger than he had realized. No wonder none of the old chaps from the British Library wanted to come and catalogue it. It would take months. The room was long and narrow. It was at least 80 foot in length by probably 20 or 30 feet wide. The outer walls each had one long shelf down the whole length full of various sized books. And in the center of the room, there were 2 long bookcases that ran for its entire length. There were no quick access points to any parts of the library. You had to walk up and down its length to get to the very end, like a cattle market. Incredibly dangerous in today's terms, with only one way in and one way out. At the very end of the 2 lengths, once you'd walked up and down 3 times to get there, was a table to study at with a lamp, and an incredibly comfortable old chair. There was a small square window high up on the wall, but it gave no clue as to the gardens outside. The chair looked better suited to be next to a roaring fire, to have a nap in on cold winter nights. But here it was in the depths of the library. Arthur left Boggart alone and shouted that Mrs. Evans was in the kitchen should he need her. There was chicken Kiev for dinner, and Mrs. Evans' cooking was not to be missed. Mr. Boggart decided to get dinner out of the way early so he could spend the late evening in the library assessing his plan of action. Mrs. Evans was indeed a wonderful cook, and after she served Mrs. Sallow in her chambers, she left the house, just like Arthur had said, promptly at 6 p.m. Boggart waved to Mr. and Mrs. Evans as they pulled out of the driveway. He headed to the kitchen for a jug of water to take with him to the library, and as he entered the room, an oversized black cat was sat up on a shelf with pots and pans watching him. He said hello to the cat as he filled the jug. It watched him observantly and jumped down to follow him to the library. Boggart chatted away to the cat as he headed down the first aisle of books. It felt like such a long trek up and down the room to get to the desk. But he wouldn't complain to Mrs. Sallow, as he felt privileged to be there and would act graciously at all times. He had a feeling it would take more than one extended stay to log this library. What on earth was the British Library thinking, sending just him on his own? As he finally arrived at the comfy chair, he turned to sit and speak to the cat, but to his surprise there was no cat. Instead, the black dog from earlier was stood behind him. Boggart was startled. The dog must have scared the cat off whilst he was walking ahead and switched places, he thought. How very odd. Boggart patted the dog on the head, and told him he would be busy in the library working, but he was welcome to stay. The dog settled on the floor under the table whilst Boggart walked up and down the aisles making notes as he went. The books seemed to be in no such order at all. The historical pieces were with the poetry and the novels were with the atlases. The disarray of such historically important books sent Boggart's mind racing. He wouldn't be able to help himself, but sorted properly into alphabetical order, numerical order, topic, size, even color order. As was usual in such historically rich places, Boggart lost all track of time. It was close to midnight when he realized he must make his way back to his room. He headed back to the study table to bring his jug of water with him and say good night to the dog. Curiously, the dog was no longer there, but the cat was sat in the comfy chair asleep. Boggart hadn't noticed the dog walk by him to leave the room, and he'd have thought he would, but maybe he was just too engrossed in his work to notice. The night passed peacefully, and Boggart was up early the next morning to walk around the grounds, seeing as the weather had brightened up. Mrs. Evans cooked him some bacon and eggs before he set off on his walk and told him to take in the koi pond and Chinese hut at the bottom of the gardens. The hut was set in the middle of the pond with a wooden bridge leading to it. He walked over and into the hut to feel the peace of his surroundings. It was a beautiful place, and as he felt lucky to be experiencing it, he also felt a little envy that it wasn't his beautiful garden too. After walking around the pond, he headed back up towards the house via some old stables. He spotted the dog jumping and playing in the yard up ahead. And as Boggart neared, he dashed into the stable. Boggart decided to follow him and see what the stables were like inside. As he looked in, the dog was nowhere to be seen, but in the furthest stable was a big black horse. He was surprised. Knowing Mrs. Sallow to be an older lady, he assumed there would be no horses at the hall anymore. But here was a lovely-looking specimen. The horse ignored him as he looked around, so he turned back towards the house. As he walked across the back driveway, he saw Mrs. Sallow waving down at him from her room. He waved back as the dog mysteriously came running out of the stables and beat him into the foyer. That dog is a magician, Boggart thought. Then, the oddest of things happened. As the dog ran down the long corridor by itself, suddenly Boggart realized he wasn't looking at the dog anymore. But the black cat was running down there instead. Boggart couldn't quite understand what had happened. He was sure the dog was running ahead of him, but in the blink of an eye, it was the cat. Boggart decided to put it down to the late night before. Being in a new environment was playing tricks on his mind. Boggart continued on with his day in the library. He had no need of lunch after Mrs. Evans' hearty breakfast. He stayed immersed in the room until the light faded. He heard Arthur's car start up and leave and knew it must be around 4 p.m. He felt exhausted from sorting the smallest of areas that day and wandered off into the kitchen to see what delights Mrs. Evans had for dinner that night. Tonight's dinner would be steak and vegetables with a hollandaise sauce, followed by a baked rice pudding. Boggart had never eaten so well in his life, at least not since his grandma would bake for him as a boy. He was full to bursting when he'd finished, but he dare not leave anything on his plate. He didn't know when he'd experience food as good as this ever again. He needed to use his evenings productively with the amount of work he had to do. With a full belly and heavy legs, he managed to walk the long hall to the library desk where he plonked himself down in the chair and sat for a while. As he sat, he could hear the movement of the dog. Probably walking up the aisles to find him, he thought to himself as he slowly closed his eyes. As the noises grew closer, he opened his eyes again. He watched as the dog rounded the corner and trotted down the aisle. His eyes were heavy and he looked on in confusion as the dog turned fantastically into a leopard. Boggart sat upright and stared hard at the creature. He could hear the low growls of the cat as it continued coming towards him. As his eyes widened, the panther turned abruptly into a chimpanzee. The primate was running towards him at speed with rage in its eyes. In panic and confusion, Boggart pulled his legs up to his chest and wrapped his arms around himself to form a protective ball. He waited terrified for the chimp to hit and attack. But as he pushed himself deeper in the chair and panic rose in his chest, he felt the table wobble by his head. He didn't want to look out from his hands, but he had no choice. There, sat up on the table, was the black cat, licking its paw and watching him at the same time. It swished its tail a couple of times as Boggart uncurled himself. The cat showed no sign of any predatory animals being in the room. And the aisle was empty. Boggart was a man of science, and what he was seeing made no sense to him at all. Frightened and confused, he decided to take himself off to bed early. The cat followed. At 1 a.m., Boggart woke up to the cat sitting at the bottom of his bed. At 3 a.m., he woke up to the dog laying across his feet. The following day, Boggart was completely on edge. He didn't know what animal would approach him next. However, later that day he was able to meet his hostess for the first time, as she came down to the main living area feeling much better. She sat in a chair by the fire with her foot raised on a puffy. She was very welcoming and a wealth of knowledge herself. She said her father had insisted on reading as many books as she could, especially when they were staying in South Africa. He had managed to procure some ancient books there in the 1950s and returned with them to England. Many years ago now. She hadn't read them herself, but they were in the library somewhere, she told him. Boggart was glad of her company that afternoon and told her if he found the books, he would set them aside for her to see. It was only a matter of days before Boggart came across the books from South Africa. He hadn't seen the cat or the dog since his fright a few nights before. And to be honest, he was glad. He sat himself down in the chair at the end of the library and began to look through the books. They were old and worn. The paper was yellow throughout, and they had a particularly strong smell of incense to them, which he found very unusual. As he skimmed through the pages, he could see it was a handwritten book with hand-drawn pictures and paintings in. There were drawings of herbs, plants and strange animals. The text was very unclear, but it seemed it might have been some kind of hoodoo practitioner's book. One page in particular caught his eye. Its title was, "To Shift Thy Shape. Should the practitioner demand the ability to change form, a sacrifice of the required shape must take place." Boggart's mind began to puzzle over the book as he saw written in pen at the bottom of the page. Dog, cat, leopard, chimpanzee, horse, spider, crow. He decided to take the books up to Mrs. Sallow in the living room and let her view them before they were logged. She looked him over and he pointed out the writing in the books. Of course, Mrs. Sallow recognized the writing immediately as her father's. Boggart sat watching her look through the books and began pondering over the ludicrous storyline his imagination was creating. What if Mrs. Sallow's father had performed the ritual to give himself shape-shifting abilities whilst in South Africa, and now shifts between the strange animals at Shivering Hall? That night, Boggart was awoken from his sleep by the cat jumping off his bed. He could hear the animal's movements in the distance, and was sure he heard the front door open and close with a creak. He decided to look out of his bedroom window. Underneath him was the dog, running across the yard to the stable. It ran in as Boggart stared at the doors. Suddenly the large black horse he'd seen days before came jauntily out of the stable and ran off into the grounds. Boggart was as confused now as he was when he arrived. He stood in the darkness thinking over what had occurred since his arrival. Understanding now why the staff don't live in at Shivering Hall. As he mulled things over in his mind, the horse galloped back up and into the stable. Next the dog ran from the stable to the front door. And within minutes of the door creaking, the black cat was jumping back on his bed. It was almost laughable now. But there was something about those animals that brought with them an eerie feeling. Something very predatory about their nature. Even the cat and dog were not particularly friendly. They just seemed to be there to keep an eye on you. The final straw came for Boggart when he had fallen asleep in the library chair one night. He sensed he wasn't alone and opened one eye to see the cat strolling down the aisle towards him. He opened his eyes a minute later to see the cat near his feet ready to jump on his lap, so he closed his eyes again waiting for the familiar feet to land on him. Unfortunately, horror ensued as he felt the weight of something land on him that definitely wasn't a cat. He opened his eyes to find a large black spider climbing up towards his face. Its back was as big as a football and its legs were over a foot long. The terror of having this giant spider on him caused Boggart to jump up in a flash and knock the creature to the ground. He sped off up the aisle yelling for help and turning to see where the beastly arachnid was. In relief, behind him stood just the dog. Boggart fell to his knees with relief as a wet stain appeared on his trousers. The dog wagged its tail for the first time he had ever seen as he sat crying in a mess on the floor. The next day Boggart took a train back to London, and never dared to visit dark Shivering again. If you are a paranut like me, please consider subscribing to my channel. There are plenty more ghostly tales to share, and you don't want to miss them. From imps to demons, vampires to ghosts and dogmen to poltergeists. Dark Shivering has them all.